In this last part of our signpost tutorial, we'll be taking the low res and projecting the high res detail onto it, and then sending it to Photoshop to color it, and then we'll be pretty much finished with our high res signpost. So the first step, after having finished all the UV mapping and all that, we can see that the low res and the high res are sitting on top of each other. If I click on the low res, I can go and move it to the side, so we can see the low res is here. If I press F4, I can see the low res polygons and I can see the high res. So we can see this, they're both here, and we want them to be completely overlapping. If we go to the layers, you can see that the I don't need the base shapes anymore, but I have the high res here and the low res here. So the first thing I'm going to do, not that it matters much, but sometimes it could be a problem. I'm going to go get rid of the checkered pattern, so I'm just going to drag, say, any one of these squares, doesn't matter which one per se, and just drag it on there to make it gray, so this way you don't get any checkered pattern popping on there. So it shouldn't matter, but sometimes it could be a little problematic. So we'll close that, and so we have a gray one here, and we have the high res here. So now I can close this, and so here's a list of a couple things to make sure you take into account. You have to have all the high-res pieces. There could be multiple, in which case we have 5 here. They're on their own layer, and we have one fully attached low-res piece on its own layer. As we can see here, the low-res, if we grab just the low-res, but so that's the high-res. If we grab the low-res, it's one fully attached piece. Everything is connected. There's no pieces. It's one whole piece, and all of it's unwrapped. So if we go to open the UV editor, you can see it's all unwrapped and it's all contained as one complete object. So you can have multiple high-res pieces, but you have to have one low-res piece fully unwrapped. So let's put this back where it was. And then make sure you have mental ray assigned in the assign renderer. And that is over here under render setup. So you scroll all the way to the bottom. This is where you normally press the render button to see pictures. All the way at the bottom under assign renderer, we want to set that from the default to mental ray. And I'll show you what happens if you don't, but I'll put it on there for now. So we have mental ray assigned. Oops, don't need to press render. If you press render, it's just basically going to give you an image of what's on the screen. But that could take a little while to render under, depending on the settings. And I don't need that, so yeah, it's just going to render an image. So that's not what we want to render. We want to render the texture maps. So let's close that, and we don't need this. So all we had to do is set mental ray on there. Alright, once we have mental ray, and we have everything unwrapped and everything, make sure you're on the low res. You can actually rename this if you wanted to. This is what I think ZBrush called it. We can call this low res. You don't have to do that, but sometimes it helps, that way you know what you're clicking on. So if I click on the low res, it'll be called low res. If I click on the other high res pieces, they'll be called whatever, which doesn't really matter. But as long as you're on just the low res, we're going to add a projection, which is right here, projection modifier. And so now the projection modifier is on there. And that kind of puts like a purple box around everything. And if you press 0 on the keyboard, it pulls up the render to texture editor. So that was again 0 on the keyboard. We're going to pick our high-res pieces. They have to be turned on first. So if they're over here and they're turned off, you're not going to be able to pick them. So if you go to pick, they're not going to be here. So make sure when you go to pick is that your high-res is currently turned on, so that they're appearing here on the screen. And then when you go to pick, you'll see them. And if we named them all 5 pieces, all the high-res pieces, we know what we're picking, but these should be the same pieces. So you can click and drag straight down to select all of them, or you can click once, hold shift, and grab all between. As long as you grab all 5, we know there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 high-res pieces. We're going to add those. And so now it's going to add, in the projection, the render texture, the projection modifier, it's adding the 5 pieces here. So now we're going to scroll down a little more. And we're going to use existing channel on both of these, on the object and the sub-objects. What automatic unwrap is it'll unwrap your object for you, but the computer's unwrap isn't anywhere near as accurate or as beneficial to us as we just already did with the unwrap UVW. Our unwrap is going to work a lot better than what the automatic does, so don't use the automatic, use the existing. And the existing only works if you have an unwrap already on there. So now we can scroll down here a little further, and we need to add two different types of maps. I can add a bunch of them, but I'm just going to go with normals and ambient occlusion. You can hold control and add both at once, or you can do it individually. There's a couple other ones which add different benefits, but right now we're just worried about the normals and the ambient. And notice the MR right here. If you don't have mental ray on, this won't appear. So if I cancel that and I go back here, just to show you, the sign render is not under mental ray, if it's under default, and then I go here to add, I'm not going to get the ambient occlusion because it's a mental ray option. So that's why we set it to mental ray earlier. So if I set this, cancel, set this back to mental ray, press OK. So now I don't need this anymore. Close out that, and I go to add. Because mental ray is on there, I have the option for ambient occlusion. So I'm going to add those two, normals and ambient, and press add elements. And what it did is it added both of those normals and ambient to our list of output. By default, I set to 256. I can change that to 2048. So pick the high settings you want, and it'll give you really good quality. And under here, it's going to say what's the name. It's going to be called mole maps, and where is it going to save it at. And so this is where we need to set a designation. Location. I have it set to midterm project, and by default it's set to Targa, TGA, but you could change different settings, but I'll leave it on Targa, and press save. So we know where we're saving it to. We're saving it to our midterm project folder, and default settings should be fine here. Alright, but it only does that to 1, so we have to change the second one, so you have to click down here because that's still set to 256. So I have to again set where I want that to save. It's already set to midterm project. And I want this to be 2048 also, so it'll make two 2048s, the normal and the ambient. These are really high resolution, so you should get really good results. Scroll down, and that's pretty much it for here. So we just changed a couple things. We picked the points that we wanted once they were turned on. We set it to all to existing channels. We added the two maps, and we set the settings down here. Now we're going to jump over to this side. Since we have a projection modifier already on here, this gives us some options to modify. As you can see, this is purple outline sitting on our object. It's pretty much encasing everything. If I scroll down here under cage and expand out the cage, you get a couple more settings. If I click shaded, you can see that it puts this kind of translucent, semi-transparent cage around our object, so we can see that it grabs everything. But we don't want the cage to be too big because it might conflict with grabbing other objects. So we're going to reset the cage. I'm going to click on the reset button, and that resets it. If it's easier, you could press the F4 and turn off your lines. You don't need those on. But if you look closely, what's happening is the cage, its purple outline, is not big enough. It's not encompassing all of the high res. The cage has to be large enough to fully encompass the high res. If you don't, you're going to have issues. So if you go to the push amount, you can push it higher, and you can see that the cage grows as I'm dragging up the push amount. So I want to bring it until it just covers the high res. And by doing so, we can look around and make sure it's sitting there. If it doesn't cover the high res, it won't actually render. We want it to be just big enough to cover the high res. If you push it to like something really large, sure it'll cover it, but you're going to get a lot of overlapping pieces, and that could distort the render. So Control Z. We just want to make sure it's just enough to cover the high res. Now, 2040 is going to take a little while to render, so if you want to do a test just to make sure it works, we could do 256 and 256 just to make sure it comes out correct. So if we do that, we'll set the settings here, so we have a cage on here, we know how big it is, and we'll press render. And the computer will say it doesn't have target map slots, that's what this area is, but that's okay. We'll assign it ourselves. Press continue, and now it's saying that it doesn't know where whatever this is. So we'll press continue anyway. Actually, it didn't work. I guess it didn't know where to save this. So let's go back to here. It should know where to save that. It should know where to save that. So press render again, and okay, so now it's working. And it's missing this file, which doesn't really matter, so let's press continue anyway. Alright, so it's rendering, and you can see that it's calculating all of our maps. If there's any red spots, that's an error and it's not big enough. You can see there's a red dot here and a red dot here. If I zoom in and move over on the screen, you can see it's missing a little bit of it right here. So wherever that piece is, I'm not exactly sure where that is, but it's basically saying the map isn't large enough. So let's say, just to show this example a little more, I make the cage and make it a bit smaller, so we can definitely tell that the cage is missing here, it's missing here, it's missing here, and it's not big enough to cover the whole high res. So I'll do 512 just to make it a little bit bigger. My computer can render it fast enough. So we'll press render, and we're going to press OK, and overwrite the files because we did it once before, and that doesn't matter. So now you can see that it has a lot of red spots. Whenever there's a red spot, it means that the cage of the low res wasn't big enough to cover the high res. And the black spot will be turned into a black spot on here. It's just be really spotty. We want to make sure we don't have any black spots that are going to mess up our textures. So we want to make sure the cage is big enough so we don't have any red. If it's a tiny little speck, then you're probably okay. You can fix it in Photoshop, but that's too much work to fix. So we're going to make the cage big enough to cover everything. So let's look at this part right here so we can see if it's big enough. Make it large enough so it covers all that. Alright, it looks like it's covering that. That should be big enough. So again, I'll test it again. If you're sure it's big enough, then you just could set it to full size. But let's see if it works. Press continue, overwrite, and continue anyway. Alright, and we can see here that there's no red anywhere, so we're good. I don't have to finish the test render. It shouldn't take too long. It looks like there actually is a tiny little bit of red spot right there, so it could be a little bigger on the cage, but that tiny speck really shouldn't matter in the long run. But just in case, I'll punch up the amount just a little bit more, and that should be enough. So I'm going to set everything back to 2048s now. 2048s and everything, and 2048s could take a little while to render, but the computer should be fast enough to handle that. So depending on your computer or the one you're using, it could take a little while to render 2048s out, but everything should be set. We've set all the settings here, we've done the cage, we've punched it out large enough to cover everything, and so let's press render. And again, it doesn't have a map slot and wants to overwrite the files. And continue there. Slide that up to there. And so now we can see that it's using the same UV cutout that we made. We cut all the pieces out, and it's rendering all of the high-res texture. So anything that we sculpt in a ZBrush is being created now on a texture plane for us. So we don't have to actually draw all of this in Photoshop to make it look like it's punching out. It's being calculated on the computer. And 2048 is a pretty high resolution, so you'll be able to see a lot of the really clean detail on this. As far as the blacks and the whites, you can see it's really bright right here and really dark right here. That doesn't matter. You're not actually going to have this on your picture. This is it's rendering what the screen is actually seeing. So if you've noticed, the screen, it's bright right here, bright white on the front, and as it curves around to the back side, all this stuff is kind of starting to turn black. So if we were on the other side of the screen, or the monitor we're looking at, you'll see that all of this is black on the back side, which is why it's black right here, because it's in the shadow. The light source is coming from the direction that we're looking at, so which is why this is all white, and so it's just rendering black because that's kind of what it's seeing back there. But it's not saving the shadows right here, so it doesn't really matter. But otherwise, you can start to see that it comes out with the really clean detail, nice sharp resolution. So all of this is getting saved to the project folder that we named, and it should be nice and clear. So it looks like there's a tiny bit of red spot, but again, we can fix it in Photoshop where it's not really that big of a deal. It's only a tiny little speck. It's not like the previous time where it was covered in a lot of red stuff. So this should only take a little bit longer. If I move this, oops, over here, I can grab this and see how long it's taking. So it's around 63%. And if I close this window right here, it'll still keep rendering. It won't actually stop rendering until I press cancel right here, but I'm not going to cancel it. I'm just going to let it finish the render. And we don't need to use the save button up here because it's already being saved. In the previous menu where we set save location, it's already being saved to that location for us. We don't need to press save. That's only for if you have the template that we're trying to get out, the UV template. So as you can see now, it's just about finished, but all the detail, every little speckle that we put on there, every little scratch or bark that we scratched into the tree branch, and the sign, and the rocks here, even little swirls on the top of the where the tree was cut, all of that is being picked up from a high-res model, and it'll be put onto our low-res model for us. So if you exaggerate things in ZBrush, it really makes it stand out a lot. So you try and exaggerate things a little more than you would normally think to see them. So that should help. Alright, and it looks like it reached 100% and it's saving, and boom, here's our finished piece. So if we zoom in, we can see it has a lot of the detail, but we don't need to save this, so we'll just press close on that. So it's already been saved now. So we can close this, and it should have been saved to our folder, so we'll go to Material Editor right here, and we'll pull this up. And so on this material slot, I'm going to go down to Maps, and we can see the Maps category as we usually see. Diffuse Color, I'm going to put this as, we'll go to Bitmap to pick the file that we want, and where we saved it at. Desktop, midterm project, and this was called the low res, which is the name of our object, ambient occlusion. And you can see all the blacks that were there aren't there anymore. It's just picking up the shadows of nearby objects. So ambient occlusion is our color map. It hasn't been colored yet, but it still has our shadows. So we're going to use this as our color map, and press open. So that's been added on here. Let's go back up to the parent menu, which is right here. And now for the bump map, we're going to click on the none. And we're not going to pick a file, we're going to pick a normal bump, which means give me the purple map. So we're going to pick normal bump, and then it's going to bring us to a sub-menu saying, what normal map do you want? So we're going to pick on none, and now we're going to pick bitmap. So don't pick bitmap first, and don't pick normal map twice in a row. You pick normal the first time, and then it asks you what normal do you want, and that's when you pick bitmap. So you press OK, and you pull up the purple map, which is the normals map, and you press open, and now it's back to the same menu we saw before, which, you know, it has your tiling and which picture do you want and the settings and the reload and view image and stuff. Let's go back up once. You'll see we're back to here. We'll go back up a second time, and now we're back to the main menu. So there's two menus inside of the normal map, but just one in the ambient occlusion. So now we have this. I'm going to grab, actually, let's make a copy of this just so I can make some changes. So I'm going to hold shift and drag out a copy. Put that over there, and just a copy. I don't want to change anything, so let's just make a copy. And now I'm going to collapse everything, collapse all. And this way it gives me a warning, press OK. It turns into just an editable poly, there's no more unwrap or projection, it just compressed everything. So there still is UVs on it, there still is all the detail we did, it's just collapsed, we just don't see it in our list of things we can change now. So I'm going to grab this and drag this on here. And again, nothing happens because we haven't turned it on. So I press the on button, and you can see that it added some detail to it. It still doesn't look super high detailed. All we're really seeing now is shadows, the dark spots. So we can see some shadows inside of there, but that's about it. There's no real detail in there. It's just giving us some indication of shadows. That's because it's on regular standard mode. So if you click and hold it and put the blue one on, this will put it on high resolution mode. So put it on high res, and it turns on the high res. So now we can see that it has more bumps, except the bump is still set to 30. So let's set that to 100%, and boom, now we can see what happened. So if you don't have it on high res, you're only going to get just the black and white shadows, but the high res will give you the normal map. At 100%, you can see all the detail. So let's go back to here, can turn off, actually this is still on the low res I think. So yeah, it should be on low res. So I'm going to add this to the default so I can turn off low res layer. So now I can see, you don't have to do that part, I was just to separate these. So you can see the high res and the low res. So this is what came out of ZBrush, and this is what got projected onto the low res. So this is 500,000 polygons, and this is 1,000, and more or less they look almost the same. So we've projected the high resolution onto the low res, and we can spin it around, and from every direction we look at, we're seeing what used to be ZBrush on a game resolution model. If I turn off the bump, then it's just a simple object under 1,000 polygons, but with the bump on there, you really see what's happening here. And the diffuse being our color, right now it's only giving you black and white, so it's enhancing the shadows, and we'll get more into that in Photoshop. But as we can see here, it's pretty much an exact copy of the two. And that's what we're aiming for, is creating a high resolution object, but low res. So now we've done this, now the last part is just basically to color the object. So we're going to switch out to Photoshop now, and grab our two files, the low res and the normals. Over here we can see the normals, and here we can see the ambient occlusion. The normals, we don't have to do much to. You can play with some settings. If you go to levels, which is Control L for the shortcut, or you can go to adjustments and levels. You can see it's Control L. Here you can adjust some settings. If let's say we slide this over some more, so we slide the black one to where it starts going up the mountain, and this to the high point of the mountain, and turn off on preview, you can see that it kind of sharpened it a little more. It kind of makes things stand out a little more. That's optional if you want to. You can also adjust them in through here, going through all different subcategories and kind of specifically pointing out where exactly you want some of these things to go. You could slide this over to here, slide this over here, but again, that's not really necessary. It just kind of helps a little bit, but RGB seems to work. So you can either cancel out or just leave it as is. If you do, just press Control S to save it and jump back over to here, and you might see a couple little adjustments where it pops out a little further. But if you don't want that, you can always just go back to here, Control S, and jump back to here. There's some minor detail changes. Over here is the important part. This is the one we're going to color. So if you want to make the dark stand out a little more, you could also use the levels, Control L, and slide these around. So say we slide this a little further this way or this way. The further left it becomes brighter, the further right it becomes darker. And you can see a lot more shadows. So if you slide it to a good point, let's say here, turn this off and on, you can see that it's making the shadows a bit more pronounced. It gives you a lot more detail in the shadows. It's kind of optional also if you want. So let's press OK. And then let's do a Control, let's not save yet. Let's jump over to, we can close this one now, we don't need that. Let's fit this one on the screen. And let's pull up our files for the textures. So textures right here, we're going to grab these textures and start applying them to our object. So we're going to grab all of these and throw them all into Photoshop. And I have it set to tabs right now, so it opens all of them in different tabs. Sometimes in the newer Photoshops, it seems to line them all up here, but you can change the settings or rip them off the tabs. Tab being something like this, where it puts it in tabs. I prefer it to just be, oops, put it in that one also. They're just separate objects. So let's say I take this one and go to the Move command. The shortcut for the Move is the V button on the keyboard. I'm going to drag this onto this image, and you can see if I zoom out, the default setting for zoom is holding Alt and using the scroll wheel, but I set mine to not using Alt. But again, holding Alt and using scroll wheel will zoom in and out. I can move this around, and if you do Control T, which that's the shortcut, otherwise you can go to Edit, Free Transform, but Control T will show you where the outline is. I'm going to hold Shift and scale this all the way down because I want to put this just on the sign. So I'm going to slide this over to here and then zoom in really close. The pan button is the spacebar, so if you hold spacebar, you can move your image around as you're looking at it and then zoom with the scroll wheel. And so you can zoom in really close and pan it over there. So I'm going to keep moving this until it covers through the white is on the border. I'm going to slide that over to there, and then I'm going to just scale it a little that direction to kind of fit everything. So it looks like it fits. Alright, and since it fits there, I'm going to press enter, and that confirms it. But we no longer see the original map under here. So if we double click in the background, it'll unlock the background. We can press OK, and it takes that little lock switch off there. So beforehand there was a lock and now there isn't. I can drag this one on top. So now I don't see the wood grain. But since this layer is on top, I can go to normal and set that to multiply, and that'll overlap the shadows on top of the wood. So now if I turn it off, you see the wood by itself, and now you see the shadows on top of the wood, because this layer has multiply and all the remaining layers are just normal. So the top one, we want to multiply down the shadows. So now we have the wood grain here, and we can see that it covers all of our sign. That should be good enough right there. By default, let's see, we probably don't need a screw right there, so I could probably adjust the size of this and stretch that back up until it gets rid of the screw. So that should work. If you look at it, it looks pretty clear, but it can be clearer. Filter, sharpen, and you do sharpen, it'll make the details stand out a lot more. So before it was just a little blurry, and now it's a lot more clear. And the reason is we took a giant image and scaled it down, so the sharpen will clarify a lot of the detail to make it look a lot more realistic. And we can drag it back in again, or we can take the current layer and drag it on top of the new layer button down here, and it'll make a copy of it. And with the copy, I can just drag this over here, go to Control T for transform, and I can hold shift and it'll click into angles. If I don't hold shift, it'll go at any different angle. But this way I know it's 90 degrees vertical. I can align it and scale it to fit. Alright, and press enter to confirm it. And if you want to do the filter again to make it a little more clear, you can go filter or just Control F is the shortcut to use the most recent one you've done. And in this case being sharpen, Control F will sharpen that. So that makes it a little more clear. I could probably clear this one up a little more if I wanted to, by clicking on this layer, which is the one it's on, use Control F, and it'll sharpen it again. So now it looks even more clear. So beforehand, if I skip back in history, it was kind of blurry, and now it's pretty sharp and clear. So I'm going to leave it on that. So we have these two, that's pretty much done. I can close that wood grain down. Alright, let's zoom out a bit. So now we have the signpost done. If I try and use a Control S now to save, it's going to ask me to save a new name because it wants to be a PSD. As soon as you put layers on here, it wants to become a PSD. You could by default tell it to be target every time, but that's constantly changing the target settings. Otherwise, if you just leave it a PSD and press save, then when you do Control S from now on, it'll always save the PSD. And so we just have to go into Max now and tell it we don't want to use the target anymore. We want to change this to the low-res PSD. Press open, and it'll collapse all our layers for us. I'll go back to the main menu, and now every time I press Control S, it'll automatically save, and we don't have to constantly go back and forth and changing targets. So here is our high-resolution signpost, or sign on the signpost. We can see that it has all the wavy curvature that we sculpted into it. It has nice clean details, and it looks very sharp and crisp. From a distance, it looks pretty photoreal. So we'll leave it at that. We still have to do the bolt caps though. So let's jump back to Photoshop and find that one. Control Tab will switch between different tabs you have. So I want this one and this one. So I'm going to take this with the Move tool and drag it on top of this one, and it should drop it in this this project we're working on. Looks like it didn't actually drop it in there, so let's try it again. So click and drag, and there we go, I dropped it in there. So I shouldn't need this anymore, so I can close that out. So I'm going to take this file and move it over here so it sits on top of there. Let's do a Control T and scale it down until it looks like it'll cover the two bolts. Unfortunately, I don't know where those bolts are. It's kind of hidden. So I'm going to press enter and confirm that. So next step, let's click to the layer underneath of the one on top and make a new layer. And on this blank layer that we just made, let's go with the bucket tool and fill with white. So we're going to use bucket and paint on this blank layer. And what's going to happen is it's going to paint white. Let's turn this off. So I painted white right here. So beforehand it was this, and I painted white and it covers everything. So there's an entire white layer. So if I turn this off and on, I just put a white layer down. With the benefit of this is that I can see all of the details again. So I'll turn that off and I can see the wood grain, but for right now I can't see where that bolt is. So I'm going to turn the white layer back on so I know where this bolt is. And now I'm going to go to the lasso button, which is the shortcut is L for lasso. And if I lasso around this bolt area, I'll grab the bolt, and I can hold shift, and that means it'll add another one. So I can add the second bolt. I'm going to switch now to this layer with the kind of the rusted metal, and click on masking. So if I add the masking, it should have worked, but it's also got the white layer on top of it. So I turned the white off, and what it did is that it added, it masked off that. So if I turn this off, so masking, if I press it again, you'll see that it doesn't erase the black. It's still there. It's still a square. It's just hiding the rest of it and only showing the parts that I circled, which is what this black part is. It's masking. This tiny little white speck is the white areas that it's showing through, kind of like a window. It's only showing you what is through that mask. So if I want to, I can take this little switch right here. Let's say I go to move. If I'm moving, it's going to move my shapes around, but I don't want to do that. If I take this linking switch, this lock, now I can move the image, or I can click on, so I'm moving the mask, or I can click on the image, and I can move the image underneath of this little window that I cut out. Or I can click the mask and move the mask, so you can see it's like a spotlight looking underneath of the wood to see the metal. But I don't want to move the mask, I just want to move the image and find a location that looks pretty good. I could use Control T again and squish it down to give a little more detail. Try and fit it back in there and rearrange it so it looks like it's got some interesting detail. And press enter. Control F to sharpen that up a little bit. And now I have bolts. Also, to make it look a little more standing out, I can right click the name tag right here, not on the layer button, but on the word layer, and it gives me blending options. Under blending options, I can throw a drop shadow on there, and that kind of makes the bolts pop out a little more. So before and after, it looks like they're working a little more. So I press OK on that, and now I can do Control S. Because it's PSD, it will automatically update here without asking me to resave a different name. So now we can see the bolts are popping out on top of the wood grain. Alright, and so that finishes up that. Also, you may notice that the wood grain is kind of sitting on top of this tree. I don't really want this wood on top of there. If I turn this off with the eyeball switch, you'll see that it's overlapping there. That's too big of an area. And the reason is this wood grain is kind of large. So I could go to the eraser button and erase off, click on the correct layer. It could erase that, but that's it's permanently erasing it. I like using the masking option because I can always, as you saw here, rearrange the original because it doesn't destroy the original. So if I go to lasso, which is the L button, and on the current layer, I want to say I just want this shape. So I can select just this shape with the lasso tool. Okay, and so I lassoed out the front of it, and I can click on mask, and what it does is it takes it off of there. Because the mask has, let's say right click disable mask, it took the original and cut it down just to the part that I want to see. So now it's not overlapping anymore. This one doesn't have any overlapping issues on anything, so that should be fine. Actually, it might right there, but it's kind of unnoticeable. So that worked for the sign. Next up, let's go with this rock texture. So I'm going to press V for move and drag this on top of this image. And the rock, which is the bigger circular one, has two pieces. And they kind of got separated from each other. This is the bottom, this is the top. So I'm going to need to use two different pieces. Kind of like I kept these together so they're nearby each other, but these were kind of moved apart, which doesn't really matter. I'm going to move this up to here, and then Control T for transform, and scale this to it looks like it fits. It's not overlapping anything else, so that's fine. Press Enter to confirm it. And if I look at actual pixels, the filter, again, will sharpen this up, so Control F. You can see it sharpened it, so before and after, it adds that bit of realism and extra detail to it. So let's do that again for the other one. Let's drag it again into here, put this in the bottom corner. And it looks like, let's see, Control T, this can scale in, but this should probably go up a little bit higher. Normally you don't want to scale anything larger than the original image, but in this case it's only a tiny bit, so that should be okay. Press Enter to confirm it. Control F to sharpen it, because that was the most recent filter used. So again, before and after, it makes it a bit more clear. So I can close this now, I don't need this anymore. But you can see again, it overlaps the pieces that I don't want it on. I don't want it on the wood, and I don't want it on the stone. So again, lasso with the L tool, and just trace out the shape that you want to keep. I want to keep this shape. Boom. And then press mask, and it masks out just showing the shape. You can see here that it kept the white area. This white is what you're seeing here. If you hold Control and click that, you can reselect the outline that you had. If you double click it, actually it gives you display options, but otherwise you can deselect that, and it shows you what you're looking at by looking at this. You should also be able to go to, you can disable them, and you can delete them, and you can apply them, and you can do other options. Alright, and so that should be all we need for this mask. So the next part, let's go with the stone. So let's do Control Tab to switch over to the stone color. Let's go to Move, which is V. Click back on here. Drag this, click and hold, over to here. And it drops the stone in here. So let's put the stone over here. It looks like this one's longer on the side and shorter on the side, so I can probably just rotate this instead of trying to transform it. So let's rotate this. If I hold Shift, it'll lock it to a vertical position. Drag this down so corners are matching, and then I can adjust that down a little more in that direction. So press Enter to confirm that. Control F will sharpen that. And again, we want to lasso and keep certain parts. So again, you could delete it and erase off the part we don't need, but I'd rather keep it just in case we want to adjust something later. Let's zoom in. If you think you missed a spot like here, you can hold Shift and it changes to a plus sign, and you can add parts back in. So let's add that, and it adds more back in. Alright, so that's there, and so we're going to press masking again, and it cuts it off of where I don't want it. And again, I can drag it in again, or I can just make a copy. Another way of making a copy, if you go to the Move command and you hold the Alt button, you can pull off another copy. In this case, it kept the mask, so I don't want the mask, so I'm going to right click and delete layer mask. So now it's just looking at the original object again. That's another way of copying, holding Alt and moving something, or you can just drag it on top of there, or there's Control C and Control V. So again, Control T, try and adjust this to, it compresses all the detail closely on top of there. If you make it too big, you're going to get a lot of stretching, I guess, but if you make it more condensed, you add a lot more detail onto your objects. Try and make it fit as close as you can. Press Enter, and then again, Control F is filter for sharpen. And we need to get rid of other spots that it overlapped here and there. So again, lasso, and select the shape that you want to keep. and mask off the rest. Boom, so it clears it off. And so now we have the stones done. If I press Control S and jump back to max, we now have stone textures on there. And from all the directions, you can kind of see where the two textures don't match anymore. The blue all of a sudden becomes this orangey color. That's where the seam is. So we tried to make the seams in places we wouldn't notice so that you wouldn't necessarily see this break part. So when you're looking from the normal view, you don't really, there's a little bit noticeable there, but otherwise most of it looks fine. And again, the sides of these rocks, there was a seam cut here, but we don't really notice it too much. Most of the seam was on the back side, which is this line. But otherwise it looks like it's pretty good. The seam on this branch, it came down here, tried to match as much as it could to the bark, and it comes straight down here and curves around. And so we can see the seam pretty well. You could erase that off of the ambient occlusion map if you wanted to, but it should also fade away pretty well when we put the bark texture on there. Let's jump back to Photoshop, and the last is the bark now. So I can close the stone. Actually, let's do this first. So this picture is kind of rectangular in shape, so I'm going to lasso out and grab more of a circular image of it, which you could lasso it, or you could even go to this rectangle tool, click and hold, and grab the elliptical marquee tool. And then when you click and drag, it'll start dragging a circle out. So I'm going to Control Z that, start in the upper corner, somewhere around here, drag that out, and try and go as large as I can so it grabs a circular amount of these. You can hold the space bar and pull again, or move it around. So I have a circular amount of that grabbed, and now I can use the V tool for move and drag this over to here. Control T to transform it, and then scale it down and try and fit it everywhere it needs to go. So I know this needs to sit here. I can probably make it a little smaller. Use the arrow keys to slightly adjust it, make it a little bigger. Alright, so we have that there. I'll press Enter to confirm that, Control F to sharpen it, and then hold the Alt key and drag it across. So lots of shortcut keys to get things moving pretty quick. So I have both of those, which is the top and the bottom, covered. Hold Alt, drag it again, and this time I want each piece of this to be covered, so I'm going to put that in the center. Control T. If you hold Shift, it'll scale it evenly, but if you hold Shift and Alt at the same time, it'll scale it to the center. So I can scale it down and then move it over and try and make sure it covers where it should go. And that looks about right. Press Enter to confirm it. Since we made it smaller, Control F to sharpen it. Hold Alt, drag it up to the next spot. That's probably good. Hold Alt, drag it to the last spot up here. Let's zoom in, Control T, hold Shift to keep the circular orientation. And that should do it about there. And then press Enter to confirm it, Control F to sharpen it. And that should cover all of the cutoff areas. So we have all of this cut out now, and the last part is the bark. So if I do Control S and take a look again, it just dropped all the woodcut caps off there on the tops and the bottom. And lastly, the more tricky part is putting on the bark. So back on here again, we can close out this. We have all those pieces here, and it's making lots of different layers, which is fine. You can leave them all separate. You can put it in folders if you wanted to. If we turn on the white, we'll see just the white. But we want to see all the colors. It looks nice and even. If I turn off the multiply, you can see it's all a bunch of shapes. But we want the shadows on there. So we have all the shadows of the dark spots of where pieces are against other pieces. So here, where the one block is touching and the other block, here's where the rock is touching. So it's adding a shadow to enhance the fact that there's a shadow here. If I save it without the shadows on there, you really lose a lot of that extra shadow area, like right here. By default, it makes a shadow, but here's a baked-in shadow, so it's not going to change dynamically. It's permanently there. All right, so the last two pieces, I have the wood grain. and I have the bark, and we have this. So let's start with the wood grain, and I'll use V for move, drag it in here, and the problem with the bark, or the wood grain, is that it's way too small. If I use Control T, and I stretch it out here, it fills the whole thing, but it's like taking a magnifying glass and super zooming in on something that should be really small. So let's Control Z that. This should actually be even smaller. So I'm going to stick with the 1 for now, put it against the side. I'm going to hold the Shift or the Alt button and drag out another copy. And so they should align pretty well. There doesn't seem to be much of a seam, so that's fine right there. If I pull it apart, you can see it pops apart, but otherwise it looks pretty good. So since I like that, I'm going to take this layer, right-click, and merge it down. This way, they become one layer, so they're connected now. They're merged together. Now I can hold Alt, not Shift, the Alt key, pull it down again until it looks like it should click in place. We can see that the edges right here match, so they're aligned, but these pieces don't match very well, and you're going to see the seam between things. Or we can flip it. So we go to Edit, Transform, and flip it vertical. This way it matches. So what is happening is it's a mirror in both directions because we flipped it, so anything that was there is mirrored, and because it's a mirror, it matches pixel for pixel. So now we've more or less gotten rid of the seam. It's perfectly matching. So again, I can right-click, merge down, so now we're moving one whole block at a time because it's one whole layer. So I'm going to move that up to the corner now. Control T, oops, hold Alt and pull that down. So we have another matching pair. So we just did it again. I can zoom out a bit more and say pull down another one, hold the Alt, pull it down until it clicks into place. It might be easier if I turn this off so I can see what I'm looking at. So that matches right there. Off and on it looks like there's a white streak, but that's just Photoshop. It's pretty much connected though. So we have that, and now I can put that back on, I'm going to grab all 3 of these, merge these together, merge visible, oops, not that, merge selected, which isn't actually giving the merge layers, boom, Control T, and now I can squeeze that a little bit closer and put that off to the side. And that seems to work. If we wanted to make the wood grain a little more tighter, let's say we cancel that, we could grab it one more time and hold the Alt key and pull out another copy until that aligns where it should. Let's turn off that and push that up some. Alright, so now they're together again, and I could do it one more time if I wanted to. Let's grab both of these, hold Alt, pull them down to about there until they look like they're fitting. And now Control T, oops, cancel, let's merge all these, oops. First one to the last one, merge layers, Control T, hold the Shift key, and I can scale it down. So now we're making the wood grain really small and really condensed. So now it looks a little more accurate. You don't have to go out to this far, but it might help a little bit. So we do that and put this back on so we can see what we're looking at. Oops, looks like we're going to make it this big. Press Enter to confirm it. Turn on that, and that should work. However, if I turn this off, you can see that the wood grain is actually at an angle. It's coming from this direction down there because when I fitted this branch in here, this log, it fit at an angle a little better. So I should have left it a little more vertical, but it doesn't matter now. All I have to do is just rotate this a bit more. So I'm going to Control T, rotate this to match the same angle, and then slide it back into place. And now I can try and scale it down to better match the shape and holding the same angle. So now it works pretty well. Press Enter to confirm it. Control F to sharpen everything so it makes it nice and clean. And again, we need to mark out what we want to keep. So lasso, and that should work. Let's zoom in, make sure I got everything. That's pretty close, but I could add a little more just in case. Alright, and it looks like that's, oops. Looks like that's overlapping a little bit too much, so I really don't want that on there. But for the most part, the masking should work like this. So let's mask that. It turns off everything else. Let's move this layer above there, and so it stands on top of that. So whatever's higher will cover up whatever's lower. Alright, and the last thing, now we can close this, is to take the bark. Let's grab the V for move, drag it on top of there. And it's super giant. Let's Control T to transform it. And let's shrink it down to here. It should work at about this size if we rotate it again, but we could also condense the bark to make it look a little more realistic. So let's put it back to about here. Press enter and repeat the same process. We'll turn this off. I'll take this, drag out a copy, and it would look better if we mirror the one. So grab the lower one, edit, transform, flip horizontal. So now they match together. They're more or less seamless. And we want it, let's take both of these, merge the layers, and if you want to just drag it down here, you can do that too. Then we can move it straight down, but we're going to get this seam because they're not matching correctly. That could be good enough, but all we have to do is go to edit, transform, flip vertical, and now they match without that seam in there, if you make it close enough. Alright, so we've extended the tree, made it more condensed in the bark. We can merge these layers together. Control T to transform it, and let's see, cancel that. Put this back on, and then transform it, so now we know we're aiming for again. Let's put that there. Let's rotate it so it goes to the same angle. Try and make it as condensed as we can. Alright, so now it fits at the same angle and it's a lot more condensed. So that you can see before and after where it was a lot larger, now it's more smaller pieces. So let's press enter to confirm that. And again, we need one more mask. I could trace it again, or in this case, since I've already done it once, I can right click, add, or grab and add it to there. But we also want to make this a little bit different than that one. Even though we want to trace out the original, we also want to just show the bark. But again, I can't see the bark because it's blending in too much with the original image. So I'm going to turn on the white so I can see where the bark outline is. Without that white, it's kind of hidden. I can't see it. But if I turn the white on, I can see where I'm looking for. So now I'm going to go and lasso out and grab just the bark. All the parts that I want to keep bark. So let's say here. And this makes it a lot easier. Oops, too much. It makes it a lot easier with a Wacom pen than it does. Actually, I'm going to go the other direction. It's a little easier. Start here. If you have a Wacom pen, it's pretty easy to trace it. If you're using a mouse, it might take a little more effort. But this should work. Let's go around here. Looks like I'm going to miss a part right there. I didn't, I'm too far zoomed in. I'll have to add some more later. And so what I'm doing is I'm creating a mask, but I'm selectively telling it, show the bark only where the bark is. Alright, and I missed the spot here, so let's hold shift. We'll add that in there. So now it's added that. Let's pan down a bit. We need to add, so we'll hold shift. We'll grab some of that. We'll hold shift still and grab some of this. And we'll add some right here. Alright, so that more or less should cover all the areas that are going to be just bark. Looks like I missed some up here as well. Let's hold shift. Alright, so that should work. So we have all the bark selected. So now we're going to put the mask on. So mask it, and we don't see anything because the white is still on. But if I turn the white off, now we can see that it put bark right there. So before and after, we're just showing this amount of the bark. To make it stand out a little more, I'm going to right click on the word and go to blending options and click on drop shadow. Let's punch it up a little bit more so it stands out a little more. Let's see what that does. So before and after, we get before and after, so it kind of looks like the bark is really pushing off the surface now with the drop shadow. So let's press OK. And so now we have our colored tree. The green's probably going to be a little too green, and the color is probably going to be standing out a little too much. So let's try it anyway. Let's do a Control S, jump over to max, and boom, it puts the color on here. But I don't really want a green tree branch, so if we pull up the reference image, which we should have right here, let's say, let's go with this one. It's a little more, let's go with the angle image. It should be a little more less green, a little more toned down. So let's jump back to Photoshop. And let's change the color of the green. If you use Control U, or you can go up to Edit, or Image Adjustments. Actually, we're still selected on the mask. Click the actual, yeah, you can tell which one it's outlined on. So we're going to change this one. So now Control U. It's Hue and Saturation, which up here it's under Image Adjustments, Hue and Saturation. We can change the hue over so we can get whatever color we wanted to. By changing the hue, it scales it. So let's say we want a little bit less green. So let's go this direction, maybe 6. So before and after it was greenish, now it's a little more brownish. Let's change the saturation down a bit. So it's a little more, the further left you go, it's more black and white. And the further right, the more colorful it gets. So we want something to look a little more natural, so it's not as colorful. Normally things aren't super colorful. So before and after now, it looks a little more like you'd see on a tree. You can keep pushing a little further if you wanted to. You can drop that. But that should work. So before and after, press OK. And the same for this. Let's go with Control U. And we can adjust the hue if we wanted to. We can adjust the saturation if we wanted to. Actually, we're still in the same object. Click this one. We can take some of the color out so it's not super bright and colorful. So it's a little more black and white. We don't really need to play with the hue too much. That should work. So before and after. And if we want to, we can go to Control L for levels, and we can play with this a bit. If I slide this further to the left, it's going to brighten up the wood grain a lot more. So before and after, it's a lot darker. Now it's a bit brighter on the wood grain. So it looks a little more natural also. Press OK. So you can keep adjusting all of these things in Photoshop, adjusting all your colors, so it's not just a matter of dragging and dropping a texture, it's also photo editing some stuff. It looks like the tree bark could use a filter. Sharpen, yep, Control F. The wood grain is pretty decent. I shouldn't need filtering, but I could try it if I wanted to. That's probably too much, just making it stands out too much. The town sign's good, the rocks are pretty good, the stones, the cut off ends, so all that's pretty good. So I should finish up the texture mapping. Let's do Control S to save it again. Jump back to max, and you can see how it color shifted it. So it took out some of that saturation. Close that. And more or less, it put the bark right where it's supposed to go. The drop shadow enhanced the shadow, so it looks like it's really punching off the surface now. We have all the curvature that we sculpted. If you look super close, you can see how the light is reflecting off the edge of the bark, so you can tell it's an uneven surface. That's why you want to exaggerate things in ZBrush, because it isn't always apparent when what you did in ZBrush if you don't super exaggerate things, because the texture alone could cover up all the work you did. So you can kind of see as the light goes around that it's not a smooth, even surface. The same should be for the rocks. As you go around, it should show you all the detail to it. It looks like we actually missed the spot right here. That should be wood grain also. So let's switch back to Photoshop. Looks like the wood grain actually covered it. So we're going to take both of these layers. So we can close that. Take this one. Let's take that and that. And let's drag these underneath of all of these stumps. So now they appear on top. So these were sitting on top of the image. So before and after they were too high up in the layers category. But by putting it down further underneath of all these pieces, it puts them under there. So we Control S again, jump back to max, and it should pop on the caps. So now we have the wood grain on there. You could probably trim it down a little bit because it looks like it's cut that direction, but you could say the branch was cut that way, or you can try and pull it down a little. Either way, you can kind of see with the normal map that it's showing that the bark should be a little further, but the wood grain is kind of covering it, so they should probably be scaled in a little bit smaller. Otherwise, that's about it. So if we pull up the reference image again, so we can see before and after that we've sculpted more or less as close as we can get. Let's change the angle a little bit. Is that we sculpted the sign pretty accurate to what we're looking like. It's a pretty high-res object. It's something you would see in a game engine, something really nice. You've run up to it and it looks pretty realistic. The larger the map, the better the detail you're going to get. This was 2048. You can scale it down in Unreal and tell it to only show 1024. If you save at 1024, it's going to be a lot more pixelated, but the game can dynamically switch through that stuff depending on your graphics card. So more or less, this finishes up our midterm project. So we'll have to just drop this in Unreal and then render us some images. Rendering again, we don't need this one anymore, but I'm going to keep this as backup. I'm going to turn those off. Turn off high res. So we just have the low res, and this is all we really need. If I need to go back, I still have the high res and low res sitting on top of each other. They're not touched, they're just turned off. I made a whole new copy and moved it away. This is going to stay in its own file in case I ever need to go back and re-render things and refix things. So we'll turn those off, and all I have is this now. If I pull up the G for the grid, I need to put this back right here in the center of the grid, and then export this to Unreal so that it's able to have the pivot point in the center. And for rendering, we just have to render a few images. So the render button is right here. You can also go to render setup. It's still set to mental array, which is fine. The size you can pick here. You press render. It'll render out the final. We can make this a lot bigger. Let's try 2048 by 2048. So it's a really big image. And let's zoom in a little and render again. There we go. So there's our final. You can also render different color backgrounds, but for now, that more or less works. Alright, and there's our final project.